Dear brothers and sisters, this past couple of weeks we've been, as Christians, bearing some crosses when it comes to our community life. Last Sunday, Mother Leandra and I used the peaceful marches in protest of abusive police tactics and the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And Mother Leandra gave a stirring and rousing talk at Hook Mill in the Sunday afternoon walk. And I want to thank her for that, her for her a willingness to share herself like that and to speak so wonderfully that many people commented to me about it. But as the rector here at St. Luke's, I'm calling upon all of us to examine our own hearts and beliefs and when it comes to this heinous sin of racism. I spoke recently in some of my sermons on how we, the white population of our country, need to look at how we're willing to cancel, obliterate, delete, or forgive from ourselves and our society the systemic racism that has engulfed these shores for some 400 plus years. To forgive means to change how we behave. It requires us to do something for the forgiveness. We hear that phrase, systemic racism. Well, what does that mean? It's the way over the centuries that a system of rules, of laws, of habits, of customs, and beliefs have been almost inbred into us that excludes people, those who are other, those whom we view as lesser than ourselves, the majority white population. But it wasn't originally in the country just towards those who are white. It was white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that made, so everybody else is inferior. White people came to these shores from Europe. We discovered this new land. We arrived quite uninvited. We were, in our own way, illegal aliens on these shores, and we claimed these shores for God and King, whether it's the English king, the French king, the Spanish king, the Dutch king, or whatever king. But to the surprise of those explorers, there were already people inhabiting these lands, these native peoples, those first peoples that were called savages by those who came, because they were uncultured as far as the Europeans were concerned. They didn't dress like us, that's for sure, and they sure didn't eat like us. But we found them automatically to be lesser. And if we wanted to own these lands, well, these people had to be dealt with. They were trying to preserve, the Native Americans were trying to preserve their own tribal territories, but the white colonials sought to bring them to heel. How? Well, by acts of genocide, by inflicting them with warfare, by bringing, unbeknownst to them, I'm sure, diseases and other types of germs that the Native Americans didn't have any antibodies to fight against, and so many of them fell sick to European diseases. The brutal acts of shooting, of hunting, of going on raids to make sure that the next area of land would be owned by the colonials. They always justified themselves by claiming that these original inhabitants were really less than human because they only made funny noises, which was their language. So therefore, the whites had the right to hunt them down, to kill them, and to gain the territory that they wanted for themselves. But these white ancestors decided that they would need help to settle and to cultivate and to build these newly conquered lands. And remembering back to England or other areas where the slave trade was very big in Europe. So let's tap into that resource. So they brought here untold thousands of enslaved people from Africa to these shores, transporting them in the bows of ships, shackled to one another around their necks, around their waist, their arms, their legs, and many of them perishing on the journey over, no decent burial, just throwing them overboard. Over the centuries, our Black brothers and sisters, ancestors, were bought, sold, traded, killed, hunted, breeded, as if they were animals as well. When emancipation was graciously granted after the Civil War, other means were found to make sure that these newly freed ones would continue not to have the ability to move upward or forward in society. And so other means were sought. Well, if we can't enslave them, then we've got to disenfranchise them in some capacity. And so all sorts of ways were found after they had been granted the right to vote by the amendments made to the Constitution, both freeing and giving them the right to vote, were to circumvent these constitutional rights by various Jim Crow laws, whether that was coming up with poll taxes that would be too exorbitant for them to pay, or literacy taxes, or all sorts of things to keep them down. Lynchings became a Sunday picnic event. An average of two of our Black brothers and sisters were lynched every day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year for 40 years. I'm not trying to, as I skip forward, ignore the struggles of the intervening years between the Civil War and today. But that memory, that system within the Black community and that system within the white community has given rise to anger over times and to protest, legitimate protest. And so we can't breathe or take any more of your kneeling on our necks is a legitimate, justifiable, and anxious and heartfelt cry. And it delineates in too many ways the current state of affairs in our country. Some people get angry when they hear that whole Black Lives Matter. Well, yes, Black Lives Matter, but so do all lives, I hear people say on a comeback to me. But I'm not one of those. You see, when we make it generic, all lives matter, we're forgetting to name the sin, that thing that keeps us from admitting that your Black life matters, your brown life matters, your Hispanic life matters, your Asian life matters, your Irish life matters. All those lives matter. But when I say it specifically to a given people, it's forcing me to name my prejudice and to encounter that prejudice. It's looking for that shadow self. And when I name that shadow self, when I say all Black lives matter, then it means I'm following the commandment to love your neighbor as you love yourself. When I just say all lives matter, I'm trying to gloss over how I am required to love my neighbor as I love myself. As long as I don't have to name it, I can keep them less. The sin of racism deals with our mentality, our white mentality, that our Black brothers and sisters are lesser than us. And so by not naming that, not naming them, it means healing from that sin is hard. But by naming, healing is possible and repentance is possible, which means changing ways. Indeed, it stops us clutching that sin and hanging on to that sin. Because when I clutch on, I'm basically saying I'm really more important than them. But yet it's a actual admission that if I say that they're not, then maybe I'm not. My life doesn't matter. We need to own up to Black Lives Matter, Brown Lives Matter, Hispanic Lives Matter, immigrants' lives matter, children lives matter. When we name the sin of our hatred and those whom that hatred is directed to, then we're open to the healing forgiveness of the Creator. Over the years, as I examine my life and my spiritual depths, especially over the recent sabbatical, the Lord convicts me. He challenges me to see the value of everyone. Over the years, I've been so proud of three wonderful friends with whom I have been privileged to share my 42 years of ministry with. Three people of color who have taught me, challenged me, shared their fears and sorrows and their life stories with me. I think of Father Hickman Alexander, who's now the rector at St. James in Brookhaven, who was my assisting priest in Bayshore. I think of Deacon Denise Galloway, who is now deacon at the Cathedral of the Incarnation in Garden City, who was with us for 2.5 years here in her apprenticeship and into her ordination, who shared with us her life and her ministry. And now I am so proud of Mother Leandra Lambert, my sister in ministry here at St. Luke's as our associate rector, who has graced me and filled me with God's blessings in so many ways by sharing her life with us and her ministry. You see, our scriptures, Hebrew and Christian testaments, challenge us to see with the eyes of the God who creates all of us in that divine image. It means everyone has equal value. When for us Christians, Jesus commissions us to go forth to all nations, he's telling us to go to all peoples, all nations, those of every language, people, to preach to them of his love, his mercy, and wholeness, that they might know how precious they are in the sight of the Divine One. It brings to mind those wonderful words of the prophet Micah in chapter 6, verse 8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. You see, it's not our form of justice, it's God's justice that we have to act with. A justice that doesn't say you're worth more than the other, but that you're equal to me. Not our forms of mercy, which have gradations to it, but God's loving mercy, who has shown every one of us the ultimate mercy of sending his son Jesus to die for each and every one of us. Are we willing to be that merciful? To be mindful of being humble, to walk humbly with our God. Humility means understanding that I alone cannot do it, that I alone know everything. It means walking with God, who knows our strengths and our weaknesses. Humility is our ability to own up to our strengths and weaknesses. It's about allowing God to walk with us through these troubled times. So I call upon you not to hold up a Bible as a prop, but to let the words of that Bible, when you open it up, prop up your life so that you can live and act out those words of Scripture. So we'll continue that dialogue. We'll open our hearts and minds to that Divine One who made us all out of the dust of the earth and breathed the divine breath, the Ruach Yahweh, into our very souls. Reminds me of the Black African-American poet James Weldon Johnson, a great poet in the 1920s, part of the Harlem Renaissance, who writes 7 poems on 7 of the stories based in the Hebrew Scriptures. And on the creation, at the very end of his creation poem, he says, and there God, kneeling in the mud by the water, scooped up the mud and formed humans in his image. And there, like a mammy bending over her baby, breathes into it the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And God looked on what he had made, and indeed it was very good. To my Black brothers and sisters, I have this to say. Black lives matter. And because your Black life matters, my life matters. Our lives matter. I remain one with you through the one who made us all, and to the one who saves us all, and to that breath of the Spirit within us all. May God bless you.